Following the popularity of the waistcoat video that I did, I'm now making one about making some breeches. It's quite a long one, so I've included some timestamps which you'll find in the description, which will enable you to move around and just pick on the pieces you want to. Enjoy. Well, here we are in the Rumbleifers sewing room, and let's have a look at the pattern that I'm going to be using. I'm quite a fan of Laughing Moon, and so I've got the Laughing Moon pattern here. That's pattern number 127, Men's Narrow Fall Breeches, and they're for the period of 1790 to 1820. They're very good patterns, and again, they take you slowly through the process, and I highly recommend them. This is not sponsored, it's just my practical experience of it. Next is the bit that I get a bit cheesed off with because it takes forever. But you've got to go through the whole pattern whilst they're all pinned together and make sure that you've done your tailor's tacks, because otherwise everything can go haywire later on. It's also helpful to remember that on the waistband, you only need to do the hole on one side, and that's the side that you've got your pocket watch. You don't need to do it both sides. Right, we can start making it. So the first thing you've got to do is put your interfacing on the pockets and the slash line. There. I'm off to the ironing board because I'm cheating. I'm supposed to sew these on, but I've got some fusible material that makes it easier. Okay, back from the ironing board. I've fixed those pieces to the front. And then the next step is for the fall itself, and that has interfacing also. So I've put interfacing. We have to sew those together because we're going to be turning it inside out shortly, and then we sew them. Now, one of the little tailor's tacks that I put in says that I've got to stop stitching there, so I've put my pin in to stop me forgetting. So here we go. Next, we have to trim the seams and then turn it inside out. There we go. Right, off the ironing board. So here we are on the wrong side of the front piece. That's the edge of the pocket. And this is going to be the point at which the cut is made, so you can put the front flaps on. And that will go onto it. But let's first of all make our cut. It's always at this point that I start shaking. There we go. And then turn it over. Once you've got it turned over, turn this down out of the way, and this will be coming here. So you turn it over and fit it to the edge, and you're going to need to pin the edge out of the way so that you can make your sewing seam down the edge there. And so stitch from top to bottom. So let's do a little back stitch first. Then when you've sewn the extension to the side there, you fold the lining under and then just sew that down and let that fall back. So now, if we turn it over to the other side, you've got a neat arrangement here, and that, in fact, then comes to the front. And when they're sewn together, that will be the front fall. And what we're going to do now is we're going to edge here, because that's just a cut edge held together with the fusible material there at the moment, but that needs to be edged properly. So that's the next step, and for that we need this part. To start on that, since we're working on this one, fold that underneath out of the way. So here we have the lining that needs to go on, and that's the right side, and you'll see that the pointer is closest to this edge. So then we turn it right sides together and line up that edge. Remember here that the part that's lined up is the top and not the bottom, because you're going to fold that under where the cut starts. Once it's pinned in position, you should find that this part here has protruded beyond the end of the actual cut, which is there. And so then you sew along this seam, stopping at the bottom of the cut. That's important because this is going to fold over, and you don't want to go too far, otherwise the fold won't happen properly. To get it right, I prefer to start where the cut is and come up, rather than, as the book suggests, start here and go down. Right, we come to our folding part. So the first thing to do is to just snip that corner. And we're going to fold these over. Now, because it's so difficult to do with material which needs to be ironed and pressed and moved at the same time, I thought I'd just mock this up with a piece of paper, because I can fold that and make it look easier. First to fold is you take the longer side and fold that up. The second one you do is this long side. And then finally, you fold up the pointed side. So it's like that. 1, 2, 3. Put some basting stitches in those folds to try and keep them in place, because they can be tricky. You then have to fold 1/4 inch along the outside seam to fold in the loose edge, and then fold it again along the welt fold line. That's shown on the pattern, and it's approximately along the middle. It's a little bit wider at the top than it is at the bottom, and you will see that the point sticks out further than the bottom of the slash. That's how it's supposed to be, because it's going to come over and then you sew round to cover all of this. And there we are. Now, the only thing left to do is, the pattern says you must stitch along the bottom of the point in order to strengthen it. Looking on the inside, you can see the way it's been stitched to the inner support, and then it will sew together to make the fall once the other half of the trousers are made, breeches rather. Right, we can have a bit of a break from the front of those breeches now, because we've got to move on to the pockets. Now we're talking about the frog pockets, which are at the side, built into the seam of the breeches, and they're made up of 2 parts. There's the overlay and then the actual bag itself. Here the bags now. Don't tell anyone. They're just made out of curtain lining. Nobody's going to see it. What you have to do with the overlay is wrong sides together. You fit them on top of the pocket linings, like so. Once we put it in place, we've then got to do a zigzag across the bottom line there. Now, my sewing machine is a bit ancient, and it takes ages to set up the zigzag stitch, so actually it's probably just easier for me to do it manually. If you do it with a back stitch, then it locks it all down as well. There we are. Right, okay, the pattern says we've got to put a basting stitch all the way around the outside just to keep things in place, because the next step is going to be to sew it onto the front of the breeches. And this is where we bring back the front of the breeches. Okay, so we have to put right side to right side for the pocket edges. So placing the breeches with the right side uppermost, we place it so that the right sides are together. Then on the sewing machine, starting at the tailor's tack, we sew up here and across to the other dot. So we're going to be turning this inside out, but what we've got to do first is clip through all of the layers to the dots. And also take off the corner. I like to take a little bit extra off there because otherwise it tends to bulk up a little bit. The next step is to turn it inside out. And once we've pressed it, there we are. Now, the pocket's got to be made by folding it over. So we take, on the wrong side of the breeches, we take it over like that, and we've got to sew these two sides together. And that forms the pocket bag. Okay, so we've got the pocket edge sewn, and the next thing we have to do is turn it over onto the right side, and then turn the pocket down, because we're going to be sewing up this seam here, and we don't want it to get in the way. Over on the back, what we have to do now is baste stitch the pocket to the side and across the top. I used to think that basting was a waste of time, but believe you me, it isn't, because it keeps everything in place and makes sure that you're not having to redo seams because you made some sort of stupid mistake as it all flips over onto a different position. Right, before we go any further, this part of the pocket, if you look at it, is going to take quite a lot of strain at that particular point. And so what we need to do is put in a bar stitch to carry some of that weight. So I've got a double length of silk here, and I'm going to put a bar stitch starting from the back across the bottom. And if you've got a sewing machine, you can put that in maybe with a line of zigzag stitching, but I prefer to just, because it's such a small area, I prefer to do it by hand so I can see exactly where I'm sticking the needle. And it means, as you go through this pattern, there will be several points where you put some bar stitches in, and I'll let you know when you need to do those. Main thing is to stop that corner tearing. Okay, time for a bit of change of scenery now. What we're going to be doing is the leg facings. So let me just show you on the finished piece. It's where at the bottom of the leg the buttons go, and you can see the back of those, there's a facing, and then on the front the buttons come through, and that needs facing as well. So that's the next stage we're going to go to. And here's the bit, piece number 6, the front leg facing. So I've got two pieces which are the fabric, and that's the back. Now it's very easy to get confused here, So I'll just mark the backs like that. And then the interfacing. Which are those? Now the interfacing I've got is fusible. Now I'm not going to fuse it at this point because I've got to be able to stitch around at 1/2 inch, not 5/8 for the seam allowance, and then I've got to cut it back. It was only after that I'm going to fuse it. And then we've got to trim that border off. Now this is a bit that's always really tricky because I sometimes end up cutting my fabric. So what I do generally is fold the fabric right back, like that. Now I've chosen to line all of these breeches, and so you lay the lining on top of what you've already prepared, and then you stitch very close as you can possibly get to those two sides there. And what you're going to do is go to the ironing board and fold them over once, and then fold them over again, and then sew them. You'll probably find that doing that is easier by hand, and then you end up with that neatly folded over so that all the seams are enclosed. So we have to start at this dot here as set by the pattern and go around and down the outside and stop there. So let's do that. Next, what we do is we clip the corner to the dot and then trim the seam allowance, because what's going to happen is we're going to turn it inside out. So then we turn it inside out. And after a trip to the ironing board, it looks like that. With the facings for the backs, we only do the turn and turn hem on one side, and that's the side opposite the marks. And now we say hello to the back part of the breeches. This is just the bottom of the leg at the moment, and the facings go face to face, right side to right side, and we sew that. And when you've done that, you cut just at the top to the line of stitching, and you trim to 1/4 inch all the way along to the end, and then press like that. And while we've got the backs, put some gathering stitches in at the top. But now we get on to the exciting part. We're going to stitch both front and back together. There we are. We've got what I suppose you could say is a trouser. So what we've got to do now is make a pair of trousers, and you slip it inside the other pair, or should I say the other one. Now the only thing you've got to watch out for is that you don't stitch absolutely all the way around. There's got to be space for a gusset to go in here. So at the point where the top comes straight over, you leave a mark, and that is where you stop sewing. Right, so now we've got the pleasure of sewing all the way around the seam. So there we are, all sewn round. You can see now the small marks I've done from the fact that I've now taped that seam all the way around. And we're ready now to put the top onto the fall. The top of the fall is made out of two pieces. There, the fabric, and there, the interfacing. So when you're looking at them, you're putting the fabric onto the interfacing, and they've got to be stitched together. But noticing that that side is sloping inwards, as is that one, and that slope goes towards the top. So the first thing that we do is sew around here, and then you have to trim them. Once we've got those prepared, you put them right sides together, and you end up with the top like that. Once you've pressed the seam allowances back, you then fit it to the top of the fall. Double marks are double marks. Once we've sewn that, we flip it up and press it, and then we'll be trimming that seam allowance. The next step is to insert the fall facing, and that comes in two pieces. So we've got to stitch those together. And then you have to do a seam finish along the bottom. You can do that with a zigzag. I'm going to do it by hand because actually I'm getting into the habit of doing things by hand. It's quite enjoyable, quite therapeutic. I'd recommend it to you if you got the time, and as far as I'm concerned, I've got the time. It's a hobby. Next, with the right sides together, stitch the facing to the top of the fall. You also have to stitch down here, stopping at the top there where it's going to fold over. It's going to be turned inside out, but what you mustn't do is stitch onto the lining. I'm going to do it by hand to make sure I get it right. Then you turn it inside out. And after you've pressed it, it looks like that. And you have to match the seam there. Make sure you got it nice and flat and pin it. And then you have to take these sides and fold them under and then stitch them to the inside. But now's the time to fiddle faddle and try and get a nice finish. Remember also, you don't want that coming right to the edge, because otherwise when the falls fold a little bit as you sit down, they'll become rather more obvious. So just take it that little bit in. And then from the front, it'll look like that. Okay, we've reached an optional point now, because you can choose either to line or not to line the breeches. Because it's the sort of satin-like material, I've decided I'm going to line these. And so here we are, the lining's already cut out. And the first thing that you do is you put some gathering stitches between the 2 points you've marked out with your Tailors Tacks there, on the higher part, the waist part of the breeches, and then you have the inner side of it. Now, because it's lining material, you can't tell one side from the other. I've also marked the wrong side of the material with a bit of chalk, just so I can keep an eye on what's happening. And the next thing that you do is cut at the edges. I've measured it out, and effectively it's a cut here to relieve where the seam allowance comes. So you're going to be folding that in over. So you cut down there, which is at the top near the fall front opening, and down here where it's going to have to fit in with the plackets on the bottom of the breeches. So, right, what we need to do is sew them together now. So we have to turn one inside out, and then right sides together. So we have to put one inside the other. I needed that break to be able to get it all lined up, because unless you pin everything together, it's 3D, it starts to get very confusing. Anyway, the seam you're wanting to stitch is the crotch seam, which goes along there and up and stops, let's make it clear, and stops at the tailor's tack that you put in there, because that's where your gusset is going to go at the back. Now, this is where the breeches come back into the picture. I've got the breeches turned inside out, and what we have to do is put the lining wrong side to the breeches, which effectively means you've got to put the breeches inside the lining. So there's one leg, and the other leg down there. And you end up with the breeches sitting inside the lining. Now, I'm just going to tidy this up now, but that's the idea. Next, you have to sew the lining around the falls opening there. Takes a little bit of time, but relatively easy. Just do it with a whip stitch. Nobody's going to see it. And then you baste all the way around the top and the bottoms. And when you've done that, then what you need to do is to sew in the lining to the flaps at the bottom of the legs. It's worth just saying now, maybe I should have said it earlier, that Regency breeches have a very high waist. And so don't be surprised when you're trying it on, is it feels as if it's coming much higher than you're used to with modern trousers. But stay with it, they're going to be great. Do you know, sometimes you just can't help stepping back and having a quick look to see what they're going to look like. Ooh, not bad. Anyway, we've got to move on. Put those to one side, because what we've got to do now is the waistband. And these are the constituent parts of the one half of the waistband. We've got the face material, which is, it's face down, there's the shiny bit there. Next you have the interfacing, which goes on top of it. And after that goes the lining. So the first step is to fix the interfacing to the fabric. And the next thing you have to do is to baste the interfacing to the fabric. And I've made life easier for myself here by drawing a pencil line on the interfacing so as to try and keep a nice straight line. Not going to be seen anywhere else. There we are, basted. Now the pattern instructions then say that you've got to cut away the interfacing right next to the basting stitches. So here we go. And then we stitch all the way around the side and the top. So there we are, interfacing fabric. So turn it over, and then we have to place the lining onto the right side of the fabric. Now, This is going to be turned inside out, so we need to trim the corner and also trim the seams so as to give plenty of room for the turning. Then it's off to the ironing board to turn this inside out and press it. And when you've finished, you have the two parts of the waistband, and they go like that. You'll see that this one has been marked with the requirements for the pocket. See the little marks there showing through, which can be removed at any time. So the next step is to start on the watch pocket. This is the piece that's going to make up the watch pocket. It's been cut out as indicated by the pattern, but let me show you something. That's how the watch will sit. It'll go inside the pocket, and then the watch fob will hang outside, and then you get hold of the fob in order to pull out the watch. But you'll see that you don't need a pocket as deep as the one they provided for. So what I've done is I've marked here where I intend to have my watch pocket shaped. Bearing that in mind, we'll carry on until the time comes to actually shape the pocket. So the first thing to do is to mark on the pocket material where you're going to have the pocket. It's on the pattern, you just transfer it, easy to do it in pencil. Once you've got that marked, there's going to be a fold as the pocket's made up. So turning over onto the back, we have a place where the covering must go. All of this will make sense in due course. So we take the next piece, which is for the covering. Now, this is only a small piece. I might as well have a practice at doing some hand stitching because I'm beginning to quite enjoy this. The next step is we have to stitch around the pocket opening. Now this needs to be very precise, so take care as you do it. I may be a bit of an old woman, but I'm taking it very slowly indeed, making sure that my stitches fall exactly on that line that I've drawn. Now this stage will determine how neat your final opening is going to appear. What you need to do is cut along the centre, and I'll mark it with a pencil. You cut along the centre and then out to the corners, and you go as far into the corners as you possibly can, because that's all going to be turned inside out. But you mustn't go too far, otherwise it breaks the stitching, and if you don't go far enough, then the corners all become puckered. So I use a craft knife for this. What you then have to do is push the whole pocket through the hole you've just created. And that includes the stitching around the edges. So that it's completely inside out. We'll go off to the ironing board and just crease those edges. And then it looks like that. And over on the back, like that. See, I just need to pull it a bit, but a nice, neat turn with very, very little puckering. And the next thing that we need to do is create a welt which goes over the top of that and hides the hole, and we do that by taking this piece folding it, and it will go across there in due course. But there's a bit more work to it before that. The edge of it in practice tends to sag, and so I'm going to put a bit of interfacing in there to keep it as stiff. So we fold it in half lengthways, and then we stitch, turn the corner for a little while, and do the same on the other side. Turn it, oh hang on a second, I've got to trim. And turn it inside out. Having turned it inside out, it should look like that, and you slot in that piece of interfacing and then turn the bottom edges in. We'll smarten that up and take it to the ironing board and press it, and then we'll sew invisible stitching along the inside there so that we've got a complete piece to put onto the waistband. Remember at this stage that you have the lining there. That has to be pinned back out of the way, as also have the pockets, because there's a danger that you can sew the pockets into the waistband when you come to sew it up. But to finish off the lining, what you've got to do, you've got to turn the breeches inside out. And that gives you an idea about how well the lining is sitting inside the breeches, so that it's smooth against the outer fabric. And when that's done, you then fold over the inside of the waistband lining and sew it all the way along here. The historically accurate stitch to use, we just a whip stitch as you go along until it looks like that. And you see that I've also tacked the pocket in, stop it flapping about. And so we do the same for the other side. So once you've sewn those on, it's beginning to look pretty much like the finished article. But turn it over on the back, and we've got this gap that needs filling. That's where the gusset comes in. That's our next thing to be done. And here are the pieces. The pattern provides that it should be made, both layers be made out of the fabric. And so what we do is we take right sides together and we're going to sew the top across there. Next we trim the seam allowances and clip the curves and then turn it inside out. And off the ironing board to press it. So, going from the red dot that you put in with your Tailors Tacks, you start and sew in the gusset into the back there, and you press the seams. And then you're going to do the same with the lining. Now this is a fiddly bit which is worth thinking about slowly. What you're wanting is for that to come over and to be sewn into the lining. So effectively at some stage you're going to have to close it all up. So what you need to do is, first of all, ensure that you can finish off this part of the connection with the linings first. So you sew down there, and you sew down there. Oops, wrong way around. See how easy it is to get mixed up? And you sew down it like that. So you end up with it correctly sewn for that part. You then need to sew up here onto there. So you can leave yourself a gap and work with your hands behind by working only on that seam. And then eventually you're going to need to sew these together. But don't forget, that has to be folded over when you're going down the seam, because you're going to be sewing that onto there. And when you've done those, it's all beginning to look pretty much like a pair of breeches. But we're not finished yet, because we have to put the bands on the bottom of the legs. Here are the leg bands. They're the last piece to be stitched on before we start on the finishing of the buttons and buttonholes. And the first thing I do with them is fold them over 5/8 and press them. Then with the breeches on the right side, you offer up the bands to the bottom of the leg. And you can see what I've got is the folded over seam towards the top. We're going to be sewing here on the raw edges. Now it folds over, and follow it around. You're going to have an overlap. Try to make that even on both ends, and then pin it in position. There we go. And once you've done that, turn them inside out. There we are, inside out. And once you've done that, you turn the bands down and you trim the seam allowances. Again, make sure you don't cut through your fabric. This is going to make eventually the tunnel through which a ribbon can be passed to tie the bottom of the breeches in place. Once you've trimmed the seam allowances, they should come approximately to where you folded over the seam allowance when it was first ironed. Then those loose ends that you had are folded in to give a nice clean edge, and trimmed to 3/8. Fold it over, and having trimmed it to 3/8, your next step is going to be folding it over that way. And that forms the channel for your ribbons to be tied. So thinking about practicality, when you're passing a threader through, you don't want it to catch on the edges. So what I suggest you do is you edge that onto the inside layer of the tube, not the outside, otherwise you'll have a line of stitches. And so once you fold it over, it'll be holding it in place invisibly, and also as you're threading things through, it won't catch on the inside. Right, I am unashamedly going to take a shortcut here, because I need these breeches for a ball tomorrow, so I've got to get a move on with them. And what I've done buttonholes with a sewing machine. I've also done the material with some fray stop, because with this satin it just goes absolutely everywhere. It breaks down very, very quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump forward and show you pretty much the finished article with all of its buttons in place. But what I'm going to do once I've got a bit more time, is to refinish the buttonholes manually, so that they look a little bit more genuine. Other than that, I'm almost finished. All I've got to do now is make a choice as to whether I need to put any ribbons at the bottom. For now, I don't think I will, but the thing is I've got a channel there and I can always put them in if I want to. So, now the finished article. So here we have the finished breeches. The leg bands have been finished off and the buttons and buttonholes placed. Neatly matched up with the lining, and the buttons have been placed for the falls. Now look out for this watch pocket. Sewing that button on, I've put some supporting buttons behind. Just make sure you don't sew through the watch pocket when you're putting your buttons on. I've done that before. And then you have the frog pockets, which open up and you can get inside there. And I've sewn buttons on for the braces. Do not underestimate the importance of braces. Because these come so high up your waist, if you're not of an athletic build, they will have a tendency to ride down. And the last thing you want is to be having that sagging at the bottom. It should be nice and firm in its fit. So what do they look like on? Well, not too shabby.